This is our November Zazenkai, the final Zazenkai of 2023, continuing our investigation of the Hekiganroku, or Blue Cliff Record. Today, case 43, Zan's No Cold or Heat. Engo's introduction. The words which command the universe are obeyed throughout the ages. The spirit able to quell the tiger amazes even thousands of holy ones. His words are matchless. His spirit prevails everywhere. If you want to go through with your advanced training, you must enter the great master's forge. Tell me, who could ever show such spirit? See the following. Main subject. A monk said to Tozan, "Cold and heat descend upon us. How can we avoid them?" Tozan said, "Why don't you go where there is no cold or heat?" The monk said, "Where is the place where there is no cold or heat?" Tozan said, "When cold, let it be so cold that it kills you. When hot, let it be so hot that it kills you." Secho's verse. A helping hand, but still 1,000-fathom cliff. Shoal and hen, no arbitrary distinctions here. The ancient emerald palace shines in the bright moonlight. Clever Kunral climbs the steps and finds it empty. First, some statements and stories about Zen Master Tozan. This is Zen Master Tozan Rokai. He lived between 807 and 69 of the Common Era, so a 9th century fellow like many of the great Chinese masters. This is the only case in the Mumonkan or Hekiganroku where we have something directly from Tozan. There are many other stories about him, including that he's the author of Tozan's 5 ranks, which are explored in our koan curriculum towards the end, after exploring the Mumonkan and the Hekiganroku and the Rinzai-roku. Then comes Tozan's 5 ranks. So in that sense, he's very intimately explored in our tradition. But this Tozan is the part of Soto Zen. This is where the lineage of Soto Zen comes from. It's from Tozan and one of his principal Dharma heirs, I think, So Zen, make Soto Zen. So in general, Soto Zen is not so explored in the Rinzai tradition, and there's only this one case. I think we're all familiar with another Tozan, the Tozan of 30 blows, the Tozan of 3 pounds of flax, Sangi, but that's not this one. That's a later Tozan of a different name and era. So Tozan is, in and of himself, quite the great master. And he visited with Nansen, who was, of course, Joshu's teacher, when there was an observation of Baso's death, so a memorial assembly. And he was in attendance with Nansen, who is Joshu's teacher, and Nansen was also a direct Dharma heir of Baso. And Nansen said to the assembly, "Will Baso come back to us?" And Tozan responded, "If there is company fit for him, he will. If there is company fit for him, Baso will return." Could be a whole koan just around that. Nansen, it says, appreciated the answer, as do I. Tozan studied with Isan, another great master, and Isan said, "Sermons by insentient creatures are given here for us, too, but few can hear the sermons of insentient creatures, like, let's say, rocks and trees, and grass and moon and stars." Tozan said, "I am not certain about them. Would you please teach me?" And Isan said nothing, but raised his hosu, the fly whisk, straight up. Tozan said, "I do not understand. Would you explain it to me?" And Isan said, "I would never tell you about this with the mouth given to me by my parents." That was his answer. We can't speak the sermons of the mountains and rivers and trees and rocks, moon and star, but they're speaking. You just can't say what they're speaking with your mouth. And this is a beautiful response by Isan. But Tozan didn't get it, so went to visit Ungan, who later Tozan succeeded. So Tozan eventually becomes a Dharma heir of Ungan. And Tozan asked Ugan, "Who can hear the sermons of the insentient creatures?" And Ungan answered, "Insentient creatures can hear them." "Do you hear?" "No, I don't," Ugan said. "Don't you know that the sutra says birds and trees all meditate on the Buddha and the Dharma?" So Ugan said, "I don't hear them, not with this ear, the insentient creatures. But don't you know that the birds and trees, rocks and rivers, mountains, etc., all meditate on the Buddha Dharma?" This is another way of saying all manifest the Buddha Dharma. They're just doing it. They are manifesting the Buddha Dharma. Just rocks and trees and grass and moon and star and mountain and river are just manifesting it. And at this, Tozan suddenly had a great awakening. And he wrote the following verse. "Wonderful! How wonderful! Sermons by insentient creatures. You fail if you listen with your ears. Listening with your eyes, you hear them. Listening with your eyes, you hear them." He continued to practice Ryugan, and one day he was wading through a stream, and he saw a shadow cast on the water of the stream, and experienced an even deeper awakening. And this is a translation of the verse that he composed at the moment of this great, deep awakening, where Tozan really becomes Tozan. "Long seeking it through others, I was far from reaching it. Now I go by myself. I meet it everywhere. It is just I myself, and I am not itself. Understanding this way, I can be as I am." This is a really great verse. Normally I don't go so deeply into the notes, but those are so pretty and so Zen. The heart of Zen in those verses. So now Tozan is in the role of teacher and is asked by a monk, cold and heat descend upon us. How can we avoid or transcend them? Tozan said, why don't you go where there is no cold or heat? Now he's already answered the question. But the monk doesn't get it and says, where is the place where there is no cold or heat? And Tozan, this time, he's already answered the question, but this time points the direction to the answer. He says, when cold, let it be so cold that it kills you. When hot, let it be so hot that it kills you. This is the finger pointing at the moon. Someone came into Doksan just this morning and said something that was also on my mind. In Quaker circles, when we hear someone say a truth, that it is also on your heart mind. In other words, you immediately recognize it as an underlying truth that you share. You say to that respondent in Quaker circles, you speak my mind. And what was shared with me in Dokusan was, to paraphrase, there are such tears for Gaza. I feel the dancers. I am the dancers. I am the Hamas militants killing them because they see no other way. I am those who are being killed and maimed and buried by the bombs falling on Gaza. I am the bombs. I am the frightened and mad Israelis. I am the frightened and mad Palestinians. This question that the monk asked of Tozan, it's the same as asking whether you're talking about hot or cold, or you're talking about war and peace, or you're talking about Israelis and Palestinians, or you're talking about red and blue states, or you're talking about injustice and environmental global warming, and all the other tragedies and maladies that are so present to us. How do we deal with such a complex and conflicted world, especially within the human condition, where we're amplifying our own suffering so tragically and impacting the entire planet? How do we meet such amplified suffering that collectively we're bringing upon ourselves? It's really the same question that is being asked of Tozan. And Tozan says, go to the place beyond all that conflict and suffering, where there is no conflict or suffering. just go to that place. He might even have said, go to that place regularly. You really need to go to that place regularly in order to not be overwhelmed by our personal and collective suffering. In order to not be overwhelmed by our personal and collective suffering, there's a couple of things we might try to do. We could stick our head in the sand. That might give some temporary relief, but it's not very practical, and it's not helpful at all. That's pretending like all this isn't there. It's there. He's not talking about pretending or imagining. Tozan is saying, go to the place of beyond the beyond. Go to the place of the very origin of the universe. Meet it directly, personally, intimately, repeatedly. And only then can we meet our trials and tribulations and suffering and conflicts without being overwhelmed. Only then. The monk says, I don't get it. Either I don't get it or I don't know how to do it. And either way, Tozan responds kindly, very kindly. Go to the place, in this case, asked about extreme hot and cold. How do we bear it? But it could have been extreme anything else that is unbearable. Anything else. He says, go to the place where that unbearable thing kills you. Where it's so cold, if we're talking about cold, that it kills you. That it's so hot. Let it be so hot that it kills you. Now, obviously, Tozan is not talking about a physical death. He's referring to the same place of groundedness where we're beyond not only our ego identity, but all of the polarities and contrasts and conflicts and disturbances. That when we go deep enough in our practice, our narrow egoistic perspective, which finds everything so troubling, disintegrates. Often we look outside of ourselves to others to try and at least point the way, and Tozan does a really good job with this monk of pointing the way. But from his own verse, he says, long seeking it through others, I was far from reaching it. Now, only now, I've become capable of going by myself. And I meet the sermon of the insentient creatures everywhere. Even in the pain and the sorrow and the loss and the anger and the fear and the doubt, even there, understanding this way, I can be as I am. It doesn't resolve our suffering. But when we're grounded in this way, in the beyond, the ineffable, the intimate infinite, when we have allowed ourselves to touch it or be touched by it again and again and again, we dip deep into our own nature, then we can be in the midst of our trials and tribulations, personal and collective, without being overwhelmed. And that's a gigantic advantage. It doesn't solve anything. That in itself doesn't solve anything. It doesn't untangle the Middle East. It doesn't solve global warming. It doesn't eradicate injustice or prejudice or racism. But the ability to not be overwhelmed in the face of all of that is an absolute necessary starting point. If we're overwhelmed, we just collapse. Or if we stick our head in the sand, nothing can happen. Only when we're open and not overwhelmed is there the opportunity to what? Grow, change, untangle, release, combust, digest, compost what is in a way that brings some relief. We've got to start somewhere, and you can't address these kinds of problems without first learning how to be open to them and not overwhelmed. And that's what this koan is about. If more of us can be tragically open and feel the depth of the anger, the sorrow, the loss, the tragedy, the pain of all of these troubles, and not overwhelmed, then those of us who are open to it and not overwhelmed, therefore not motivated by, say, revenge, not controlled by our hurt or our anger, then we might be able to meet together those who are open but not overwhelmed. And from a place of not knowing how to proceed, sit with ourselves and others who are suffering in the not knowing how to proceed. And in the midst of that mystery of how to proceed, be open to some insight or caring action that will come out of first admitting that we don't know. But we're grounded enough, open enough, and not overwhelmed enough to begin the process of not knowing and coming to some kind of insight about how to proceed in the midst of the suffering. For example, I personally can't do much about the war in Ukraine or in Gaza from where I'm sitting right here in Seattle. But there are things I can do with others and things that I can do on my own that have some small impact that I'm absolutely motivated to do, reaching into my pocket as best I can to send thousands of dollars to people who are sending medical supplies or food to Ukraine and Gaza. There's an organization called Doctors Without Borders. Its headquarters is in France. And I always give money to them. That's my labor being translated into something that does a little something for these distant but very real traumas facing the whole planet. Locally, we belong to, collectively as a temple, something called the Faith Action Network, and their annual dinner meeting and fundraiser is coming up this month. Choboji's purchased a table, and you're all invited. Show up. It's amazing what this organization, which has Sikhs and Jews and Muslims and Christians and Catholics and Buddhists and Hindus, all coming together to make Washington a little better place to live. It's a very slow process. It can get kind of frustrating, but I'm so grateful to Zazen that I'm not overwhelmed with frustration. And still willing to put out, personally and collectively with others, to help us untangle ourselves sufficiently to be more in harmony with the sermons of the insentients all around us. Shujo Muhen Se